The sprinklers had just finished their morning cycle when Marcus Webb stepped out onto his front porch, coffee mug in hand, and exhaled slowly into the cool October air. The neighborhood was still the kind of still that only exists before the rest of the world wakes up. Magnolia-lined Crestfield Drive in Dunmore, Georgia was the sort of place where people mowed their lawns on a schedule and knew which neighbors put their trash cans out too early. Marcus had lived here for 3 years. And in those 3 years, he had waved hello to every single one of them. He was wearing a faded grey Henley, the sleeves pushed up to his elbows, and a pair of dark navy cargo pants. His coffee was black, no sugar, the way he'd taken it every morning since his first deployment to Kandahar in 2001. He was 54 years old, broad-shouldered, with close-cropped silver at his temples and the kind of posture that doesn't come from a gym, but from 3 decades of military bearing. He had no idea the next 40 minutes would define the rest of his life. It started with a phone call made by someone he had never spoken to, Patricia Dunmore, no relation to the town's founding family, though she liked to imply otherwise, lived in the colonial revival, 2 houses down. She was 61, recently widowed, and had taken it upon herself to act as the neighborhood's unofficial safety coordinator since the previous summer. She had a neighborhood watch app on her phone and used it daily. She also had, by most accounts, an extraordinary ability to see danger where none existed. At 7:42 that Sunday morning, she called the Dunmore Police Department's non-emergency line and reported, in her words, a large black man who does not live on this street, attempting to enter the property at 4417 Crestfield Drive. She added that he had been lurking and that she had a bad feeling. Marcus Webb had lived at 4417 Crestfield Drive for 38 months. The dispatcher logged the call. 2 patrol officers, Sergeant Dale Pruitt, 17 years on the force, and Officer Kevin Sato, 3 years in, were diverted from a routine traffic check 3 blocks away and rerouted to Crestfield Drive. They arrived in 4 minutes. Marcus heard the cruiser before he saw it. He set his mug down on the porch rail and watched as the black and white pulled slowly up to the curb in front of his home. Both officers stepped out. Neither smiled. "Sir," Pruitt called out, his voice carrying the practiced authority of someone used to being obeyed. "Can you tell me what you're doing here?" Marcus blinked. He looked at the porch he was standing on. The front door with the seasonal wreath his daughter had hung last Thanksgiving. The welcome mat that read home in block letters. "I live here," he said. "Can you prove that?" He studied Pruitt's face for a moment. Then Zatos. Then he looked down the street in both directions, as if checking to see whether he had somehow been transported somewhere else. "I'm standing on my own front porch," Marcus said. His voice was level. That was the word for it, level. Not cold. Not aggressive. Controlled in the way that only comes from extreme practice. "We received a call," Pruitt said. "Someone reported a suspicious individual. That someone was wrong. Sir, I'm going to need to see some ID." Marcus had learned a long time ago in a completely different context, in a completely different kind of danger, that the worst thing you can do in a volatile situation is escalate, unnecessarily. He had taught that to soldiers under his command. He had written about it in 3 military leadership manuals. He believed it in his bones. He went inside, retrieved his wallet from the kitchen counter, and came back out. He handed Pruitt his Georgia driver's license. 4417 Crestfield Drive, Dunmore. G3412. Right there in black ink. Pruitt looked at it for a long moment, then handed it to Sato, who also looked at it. "Do you have any other form of identification?" Marcus stared at him. "My driver's license has my address on it. That's this address." "Sir, we're just trying to resolve this." "It is resolved. That's my license. This is my house. I'd like to finish my coffee." What happened next would later become the subject of a formal inquiry. 2 internal affairs, investigations, a civil rights complaint filed with the Georgia Attorney General's office, and a segment on 3 separate national news programs. Pruitt stepped forward. "Sir, I'm going to need you to place your hands behind your back." Marcus did not move for a full 3 seconds. In those 3 seconds, he did the math. He was a black man in a driveway. 2 armed officers approaching. A neighbor somewhere nearby who had decided he didn't belong here. He had served his country in 4 combat theaters. He had commanded a battalion of 800 soldiers. He had shaken hands with 2 secretaries of defense. He placed his hands behind his back. The handcuffs clicked into place at 751 A.M. They seated him on the brick retaining wall at the edge of his own front yard, while Pruitt called in the situation. Sato stood nearby, arms crossed, not quite meeting Marcus's eyes. A few neighbors had begun to appear. A man walking a terrier on the opposite sidewalk slowed to a stop. A woman in a purple tracksuit paused at the end of her driveway. A teenager on a bicycle circled back around. Marcus sat very still. Inside him, something was burning. Not rage, at least. Not yet. It was more like grief. The specific grief of a man who has given everything to an institution and finds himself, on a quiet Sunday morning, sitting in handcuffs on his own property while his coffee went cold on the porch rail. He thought about his daughter, Renee, who was 12 when he'd missed her first school play because of a deployment. He thought about his son, Darian, who had told him once, at 19, "Dad, the country doesn't care about you the way you care about it." He had told Darian that wasn't true. He had believed it. He had built his life on believing it. He looked at his hands, the hands that were handcuffed behind his back, and thought about every early morning at every base he'd ever served at. Fort Campbell, Fort Bragg, Bagram, Mosul. Those hands had signed orders. They had written commendation letters. They had held a flag folded into a triangle at the funeral of a soldier he'd mentored since the kid was 22 years old. "You doing all right?" Sato asked suddenly. It came out awkward, almost accidental. Marcus looked at him. "No," he said. "I'm not." Sato looked away. At Opt Patru, M. A black Suburban with government plates turned onto Crestfield Drive. It moved slowly, the way government vehicles always do, like they have the right to take up space in both time and road. It stopped directly in front of 4417. Double parking next to the patrol cruiser. The driver stepped out first, a young man in Army Class B uniform, who immediately surveyed the scene with the alert efficiency of someone trained for exactly this. Then the rear passenger door opened. General Raymond Aldridge stepped out onto the sidewalk. He was 62 years old, and he carried those years like a man who had decided early on that time was a resource, not a burden. 4 stars on his shoulder, grey dress uniform, pressed to a standard that most people never achieve on their best day. He had a chest full of decorations that told the story of 40 years of American military history, and he wore them without drama, the way men who have actually done things tend to do. He had been Marcus Webb's commanding general in Iraq. He had later been Marcus's strongest advocate when Marcus was passed over for a promotion due to what 2 Army investigators quietly concluded was racial bias. He had driven 4 hours that morning from Atlanta because Marcus had texted him the night before about a landscaping project they'd been debating, a garden collaboration. Marcus's wife had been pestering them both about. He had no idea what he was driving into. He stood on the sidewalk and looked at Marcus Webb, sitting handcuffed on a brick retaining wall in front of his own house, surrounded by 2 police officers and approximately a dozen onlookers. For a moment, Raymond Aldridge said absolutely nothing. Then he walked forward. Pruitt stepped into his path. "Sir, this is an active. I can see what it is," Aldridge said. His voice was not loud. It was the opposite of loud. It was the kind of quiet that fills a room completely. "I can see exactly what it is." He looked past Pruitt and spoke directly to Marcus. "Colonel Webb." Marcus met his eyes. "General Aldridge." Pruitt looked between them. Something shifted in his posture. Aldridge turned to face him fully. This man is Colonel Marcus Webb, United States Army. Retired. He served 28 years in uniform. He holds the Legion of Merit, the Bronze Star with Valor, and the Defense Superior Service Medal. He commanded a battalion in Mosul in 2005 and a brigade combat team in Kandahar in 2009. He paused. He also lives at this address, which is listed on the driver's license you are currently holding. The silence that followed was the kind that has weight. Remove the handcuffs, Aldridge said. Pruitt hesitated for exactly 3 seconds. Then he reached for his key. When the cuffs came off, Marcus stood slowly. He rubbed his wrists, a small gesture, almost unconscious. But every person watching caught it. He accepted the driver's license from Pruitt's outstretched hand without a word. Aldridge stepped forward and did something unexpected. He extended his hand to Marcus. Not the quick handshake of a greeting, the formal, two-handed clasp of a general officer acknowledging a subordinate of distinction. It was a gesture that carried meaning for anyone who understood military culture. For anyone who didn't, it was still unmistakably a show of deep respect. "I'm sorry, I wasn't here sooner," Aldridge said quietly. "You didn't know to be." Marcus said, "I'm sorry anyway." The Suburban's driver had quietly retrieved Marcus's coffee from the porch rail. He held it out now. Tentatively, Marcus took it. It was cold, but he drank it anyway. The story broke by noon. The teenager on the bicycle had filmed the entire second half on his phone from the Suburban's arrival to the handcuff removal and posted it with the caption, "This just happened on my street. B20 p.m. It had part rendered 000 views. B80 p.m. It had passed 3 million. Patricia Dunmore did not come outside that day. The Dunmore Police Department issued a statement at 3:30 p.m. calling the incident a response to a community welfare call conducted in good faith. By the following morning, that statement had been replaced by a second one, announcing that Sergeant Dale Pruitt and Officer Kevin Sato had been placed on administrative leave, pending an internal review. Marcus's phone did not stop ringing for 72 hours. His son Darian flew in from Chicago. His daughter Renee drove up from Savannah with her 2 kids and stayed for a week. His wife, Carol, who had been visiting her sister in Birmingham and hadn't been home during the incident, sat with him in the living room that first night and held his hand for a long time without saying anything. "Are you okay?" she finally asked. "I don't know yet," he said honestly. She nodded. She knew him well enough to accept that answer. 3 days later, Marcus sat across from a reporter from the Atlanta Journal-Constitution in his living room. The reporter was a young woman named Sylvia Park, 28 years old. With a notepad and the careful manner of someone who understood that this story required more than quotes. "What was going through your mind?" she asked. When they put the handcuffs on, Marcus was quiet for a moment. "I thought about a kid named Terrence," he said finally. "Private First Class Terrence Hayward. He was 21 years old. He was from Beaumont, Texas. He was the first soldier I lost in Iraq." He looked at his hands. He believed completely that what we were doing over there mattered, that the country he was fighting for was worth it. He paused. "I've spent a lot of years trying to believe that too." "And now?" Sylvia asked. "Now I think," Marcus said slowly, "that believing it and building toward it aren't the same thing. One of them is passive. The other one requires work." Sylvia wrote that down carefully. "Are you going to pursue legal action?" she asked. "My attorney is reviewing the situation," he said, which was the careful version of yes. What Marcus's attorney? Helen Cho, 15 years in civil rights litigation. A record that would make most defense teams nervous, was reviewing. Was this a documentation of wrongful detention? Denial of access to property? Unlawful arrest without probable cause? And a pattern of similar complaints against Sergeant Pruitt that the department had previously declined to act on. Helen had pulled Pruitt's complaint history within 6 hours of taking Marcus's call. In 11 years, Pruitt had been the subject of 9 formal complaints. 7 of them involved black residents. None had resulted in disciplinary action. This is not a one-off. Helen told Marcus at their first meeting. This is a pattern with a paper trail. How long will it take? Marcus asked. That depends on how much they want to settle versus how much they want this in a courtroom. I want it in a courtroom, Marcus said. Helen looked at him for a moment. Okay, she said. Then we go to court. The civil rights lawsuit was filed 61 days after the incident. It named the city of Dunmore, the Dunmore Police Department, Sergeant Dale Pruitt, and Officer Kevin Sato as defendants. It sought accountability, not just for the events of that Sunday morning, but for the systemic failure of oversight that had allowed Pruitt's pattern of racially discriminatory conduct to go unaddressed for over a decade. General Raymond Aldridge agreed to provide a sworn declaration. He submitted it without hesitation. I have served alongside Colonel Marcus Webb. The declaration read, in conditions that test the full measure of a man's character, he is, without reservation, one of the finest officers I have known in 40 years of military service. What he experienced on the morning of October 9th was not a misunderstanding. It was a failure of assumption, of accountability, and of basic human dignity. The declaration was 3 pages long. The last paragraph read, simply, Colonel Webb served this country with everything he had. This country owes him better than what it gave him on that morning. The pre-trial hearings began in the spring. Crestfield Drive had become, by then, a kind of shorthand, not just locally but nationally, for a conversation that Americans had been having. Incompletely and inadequately. For a very long time. It was the conversation about who gets the benefit of the doubt and who doesn't, about whose word is questioned and whose isn't, about what it means to serve a country that is still in certain driveways and on certain Sunday mornings, deciding whether you belong. Marcus attended every hearing. He sat in the second row of the courtroom gallery, straight-backed and still, wearing suits that Carol helped him select each morning. He did not speak to the press on the courthouse steps. He let Helen do the talking, which she did with the crisp, unstoppable precision of someone who had been preparing for exactly this moment for 15 years. On the 4th day of pre-trial motions, Pruitt walked past Marcus in the hallway, outside the courtroom. He did not slow down. But for a single half-second, his eyes met Marcus's. Neither man spoke. Pruitt looked away first. Patricia Dunmore moved to Roswell 7 weeks after the incident. No announcement. No farewell. One morning her house was occupied. 2 weeks later there was a for sale sign in the yard. Marcus learned about it from his neighbor Ted Kowalski, who had been the man with the terrier on the sidewalk that Sunday morning. Ted had come over to bring Marcus a beer and an apology. I should have said something that day, Ted said, sitting on Marcus's back deck. I just stood there. Most people do. Marcus said, that doesn't make it okay. No. Marcus agreed. It doesn't. They sat for a while, without talking. The yard was quiet. The magnolias along the fence line had lost their blooms for the season, and the leaves had turned a deep autumnal gold. It was a beautiful yard. Marcus had planted most of it himself. In the evenings after Carol went to bed, during the slow adjustment of learning how to live in civilian time, you're going to win. Ted said, eventually. Maybe. Marcus said, you will, because you're right. Marcus looked at him. Being right doesn't always mean you win. Ted nodded. I know. I want to believe it does. Marcus understood that he had spent most of his adult life wanting to believe the same thing. So, do I, he said. Still, the settlement offer came in late January, 6 months after the incident. 2 weeks before the case was scheduled to go to trial. The city's attorneys put forward a number that Helen described as a first move, not a final offer. The number was significant. Marcus sat with it for a week. He told Carol about it on a Wednesday night over dinner. She listened without interrupting one of the things he had loved about her for 26 years. "What are you thinking?" she asked when he finished. "I'm thinking about Terence Haywood," he said, "and about every other person who's been sat down in handcuffs on their own property with no four-star general around to witness it." Carol set down her fork. She looked at him for a long moment. "Trial," she said. He nodded. "Trial." The trial lasted 9 days. Helen presented Pruitt's complaint history, expert testimony on racially discriminatory policing patterns, and a detailed timeline of the morning's events reconstructed from body camera footage, the teenager's video, and sworn depositions from 6 witnesses, including Ted Kowalski and 3 other neighbors who had been on the street that morning. General Aldridge testified in person. He wore his full-dress uniform. He sat in the witness box with the precise, calm authority of a man who is constitutionally incapable of being rattled in a courtroom. He answered every question clearly and without embellishment. The defense argued, as defenses do, that the officers had acted on a good faith response to a reported concern, that the situation had been handled without violence, and that the brief detention had been a reasonable precaution. Helen's closing argument lasted 45 minutes. She ended it by pointing out, quietly and precisely, that at no point during the entire incident had either officer asked Patricia Dunmore or anyone else why she was certain the man standing on the porch did not live there. They had simply accepted that assumption. They had proceeded from it, and a decorated combat veteran had sat in handcuffs on his own brick retaining wall while his neighbors watched and his coffee went cold. The assumption, Helen said, is the case. The jury deliberated for 11 hours. Marcus sat in the courthouse cafeteria for most of it, drinking bad coffee and reading a military history he'd bought from the courthouse gift shop. Carol sat across from him, working on a crossword puzzle. Renee and Darian were in the hallway outside, pacing in shifts. Helen's associate came in every 90 minutes with an update, which was always nothing yet. The verdict came at 4:17 inches the afternoon. Marcus stood when the jury filed back in. He stood very straight. He had learned a long time ago that how you carry yourself in the hardest moments matters not for anyone watching, but for yourself, so you can live with it. Whatever comes next, the jury found in his favor on all primary counts. Compensatory and punitive damages were awarded that were, in Helen's words later, appropriate to the gravity of the conduct. More importantly to Marcus. Significantly more importantly, the judgment required the Dunmore Police Department to implement mandatory reform in its complaint review processes, bias training, and supervisory oversight. It was not the kind of requirement that made headlines, the same way the dollar figure did, but it was the part that mattered. Outside the courthouse, in the late afternoon October light, Marcus stood with Carol's hand in his and said a few words to the reporters gathered on the steps. He thanked Helen. He thanked the jury. He said that he hoped this could be a step, one step, not all of them, towards something better. Then a reporter asked him, "General Aldridge testified that you're one of the finest officers he's ever served with. What do you want people to take away from what happened to you?" Marcus thought about it for a moment. "That you don't have to be a retired colonel," he said. "You don't have to have a 4-star general show up to prove you belong somewhere." He looked out at the cameras. A man should be able to stand on his own porch and drink his coffee. That's it. That's the whole thing. He took Carol's hand. They walked to the car together. Above them, the magnolias along the courthouse walk were bare for the season. But next spring they would bloom again the way they always do. The way things have a habit of doing when you give them time and the right conditions, and the stubborn refusal to believe that what has always been must always remain. Marcus Webb had given this country 28 years. On a Tuesday in October, a jury of his peers gave something back. It wasn't everything, but it was a start.